today we've got our last in this year's fiscal year's series of ICT Educator webinars. We bring to you some of the best information that you would get if you went to a conference, except we bring it to you at the comfort of your desk. And I think it's important to pause just for a moment and look at what we've covered in the last few series. We had the creative group, Robert Knapp, talk about the digital media marketplace. In the last call, we've looked at our NetLab technology for IT classes. We had Ryan Zervakos from LinkedIn talked about using the alumni tool on LinkedIn to find people who went to our colleges and our different industries. We talked about the statewide cyber competitions that we've had. We've talked about other training tools for our IT staff. We had Ariel Coro, who's a very distinguished blogger and technology expert in the Spanish-speaking media, talked to us about how to train Hispanic students for success in ICT. That was a terrific presentation. And we've talked about more of our articulation capabilities and how we've used some of our guided pathways to branch out into new industries for our students. So this is a place where all our faculty related to ICT can come on a weekly basis, some are excluded, and learn something new that either helps you professionally or something you can implement in your classroom. So today we're especially honored on the last day of the series to have Peter Coffey, who's a futurist, and I might nag him to ask us to tell us what a futurist actually is. Salesforce.com, and he has been presenting fascinating keynotes at a series at both our Digital Media Educators Conference, the ICT Winter Conference, and every single time everybody's just blown away by what we should be able to see that's right in front of us. And Peter has a wonderful way of bringing that to the surface. And so I'm not going to delve into his background or anything like that because you'll be fascinated as I always am. And so I'm very happy to end our series this summer. We'll have Peter go ahead and go with his slides, and if you could release to Peter now, Nicole, that'd be good. And then we'll try to save a little bit of time at the end for some questions. And if you have any questions along the way you want to put in chat, please feel free to do that. Thank you. Go ahead, Peter.
Good morning, Steve, Nicole, everybody else. It's a pleasure to be with you. Steve, the futurist thing is kind of funny because there's a quote I often use that many people can tell you what the future will look like and they are called futurists, but the ones who can tell you when are called billionaires. And getting the timing right, of course, is the hard part. I sometimes say that my approach to futurism is to cheat. I don't make predictions. I just figure out what the equations of reality are and plug in future values of time, and I get things that really aren't predictions. They're just solving an equation. I stole some of this thinking from a fellow named George Friedman. Not Tom Friedman, he's the world is flat guy. George Friedman runs what he, I believe, describes as a profit sector intelligence organization called Stratfor. And he stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for quite some time with a book called The Next 100 Years, in the beginning of which he says, look, if you're talking about geography and demographics, you're really not taking any risks. These are pretty much certainties. If I know how many 20-year-olds India has today, I have a pretty good handle on how many 40-year-olds they're going to have in 20 years. It's not really a bold, visionary statement. The hard parts are seeing how several different highly predictable changes will intersect and play off of each other. And I'll be talking about some of that, especially toward the end of my time with you today. And also making the big bets, because exponential growth is a thing. People have a difficult time believing that it will happen. In retrospect, as you observed, Steve, it's often the case that you can say, wow, this was obvious, wasn't it? But making the big bets on massive growth that seems implausible in the context of what's happening on any given day, that's what's really hard. I don't actually use the futurist. It's often assigned to me. Within Salesforce, I'm considered a competitive intelligence guy, and I try to develop material that our people can use to explain the change in the world to our customers. I find that walking into a room of people running a successful company and saying you're doing it wrong is not well received, but saying you've been doing brilliantly well in the environment you're leaving and I'm here to help you prepare to continue your amazing and fantastic success in the world you're going to be in. Well, let's just say that's an easier sell. So let's talk about that, because today there are a lot of very plainly visible changes, but they are going to intersect in interesting ways. Their acceleration is going to create a need to do things differently and not just better. Salesforce is usually thought of as being a customer relationship management software provider. Our stock ticker symbol is CRM, and the first syllable of the company name is sales. But what we're finding is that the conversations our customers want to have now are about the things that work around that. It's not just the old selling. It's the degree to which data now is not transactional, but is experiential. It's data about measuring what is happening to your customer, not just measuring what you're doing with your customer. The need to be working across multiple organizations. To do that at scale requires the use in a very practical way of what has been called for 60 years now, machine intelligence or artificial intelligence. And making that work as organizations grow requires an intentional approach toward culture that's so much more than the sound bite or the t-shirt or the company party. It's a question of really, how are you organizing the way communication and decision happen in an organization? And then to do all of this, of course, in an accelerating context, which is why I am going to be focusing so much today on something that I think is relevant to all of you, which is, what is the definition of talent in an organization like that? What are its sources? What are the means by which it's developed? How do we need to look hard at what educators or company trainers, because of course a huge fraction of the education that happens in the world today is not in academic institutions, but is in training and other organizations, and make all of this work in a good way. Salesforce is a publicly traded company, and so I'm obligated to say that if anything I say today is talking about stuff we don't yet actually do, you should not make any decisions to do business with us or invest in us based on those forward-looking statements, because they might happen and they might not. So let's move on. There's a phrase that's gotten an awful lot of attention in the last few years, Fourth Industrial Revolution. It emerged from relative obscurity to become kind of a global meme right around 2016, February 2016, at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, at which point it kind of settled back to a dull roar until later in 2017, which was actually the time of Salesforce's Dreamforce conference in San Francisco. We bring about 170,000 people there every year. And I'm pointing this out for two reasons. This is global web search activity for the phrase. Number one, we've been talking about it for 3.5 years. It's not a new thing to be talking about this. Number two, to some degree, it's been like trying to build a fire on an iceberg. It's fine as long as you're feeding fuel to it, but it doesn't really catch on. Getting people to buy into Fourth Industrial Revolution at something beyond the level of reading an in-flight magazine article and getting really excited for an hour is tough. It requires a lot of people to let go of what got them to where they are, to seize on to what will take them where they need to be. It's the kind of disruptive change that challenges people's definition of what has made them valuable, what has made them important in their organizations or their industries. And I have been sharing within our company and among our customers something of a minority view on this. Too often, the revolutions are described as steam, electricity, computers, AI, and I think the major error is thinking of them as being described by their technologies. I prefer to point out what happened when those technologies came along. For example, the first industrial revolution migrated people from farms to cities in a massive way. It created, by the evaluation of some scholars, created the middle class. Before then, you basically had people who farmed the land and people who owned the land, and there really wasn't very much in between. The emergence of technology that augmented labor created the possibility for people without great wealth to have things like, you know, woven cloth and glass windows in their homes, and things that have been absolutely the luxuries of the wealthy and only them. But that steam power that created these factories, the so-called dark satanic mills, well, it did not work well at small scale. It's difficult to build a small steam engine that works really well. There were some steam powered cars. They never really, you know, worked out too well. You wound up with this concentration of capital, concentration of people, concentration of production. And that was, I believe, the most important outcome of the first revolution. And it doesn't really matter that it was steam. It could have been, you know, giant hamsters running on wheels. It wouldn't matter. What mattered was the structure of that power. It was centralized, concentrated, capital intensive. So the second revolution, it's not that it was electricity. It could have been, you know, magic fluby dust. What matters is that an electrical power grid can take power out into the countryside. And in the United States, you know, rural electrification. I mean, this is a wild, radical idea. Tiny little motors in hand tools, batteries that could power portable things. You could have entrepreneurs working with advanced technology, and not only the massive capital concentrations. So this is why the social change of the second revolution was so interesting. Now, the third revolution was when you did not just use electricity for power, but used it in much, much tinier quantities for information. I can give you a personal example of this. At Exxon's Baton Rouge chemical plant, I was there when we installed the first digital control room. Before then, to avoid dangerous explosion hazards and things, you tended to signal what was going on by air pressure in tiny little tubes, because that way you didn't have the risk of, you know, sparks and things. And you had mechanical recording devices, moving pens on moving strips or rotating circles of paper. At the end of the day, you would open a door, take the chart off the spindle, look at it and say, okay, we didn't blow up last night, that's good. We'll put the chart in a file cabinet, and it would never be seen again. It was a record. It was a retrospective archive of that which had happened before. When we went to an all-digital control room, now you had computable data. You could do trend analysis. You could make forecasts of possible errors or inefficiencies in the system. You could have learning behavior going on. So this introduction of information was absolutely key. The fact that you could do computation on it was cool, but the fact that you could do anything with it other than just stick it in the file cabinet was genuinely revolutionary. But now, instead of just saying it's going to be easy to use, it's going to be easy to look at it, well, the problem with ease of use is that it becomes easier to do the wrong thing more consistently at greater speed than ever before. Now we can introduce process intelligence into the tools so that they can sometimes even offer original insights, things that people would not even think to look to find. And the ability to embed that intelligence builds off of the other three revolutions. We can measure, we can connect, we can act, and now we can process. And so when you look at these revolutions as they're typically described, there's a sense that they were successive. First there was steam, then there was electricity, then there was this, and it's really important to see that they were really cumulative. There was a production revolution, which created certain possibilities, a distribution revolution, which amplified on those possibilities, an information or interaction revolution, which created the possibility of, you know, communication in multiple directions, not just hubs and spokes, and then an optimization revolution. The reason I emphasize this is that there's still a revolution going on in the space of production. Smart factories, flexible manufacturing facilities, 3D printing. The production revolution isn't over. The distribution revolution isn't over. We're talking now about autonomous trucks. We're talking about not having to maintain physical inventories of products, but to be able to 3D print them on demand in a remote location. For example, the space station, where they have a 3D printer up there, and instead of having to have every single doohickey that might break in a spare, sometimes they're able to print one. The interaction revolution. We're moving now from the so-called 4G to 5G network. It's really important to realize the 5G network is not going to be just a faster version of 4G. The description I've given it to people is that before we had a massive grid of connections that got faster all the time and connected computers. The 5G network really is a massive global computer that can imitate a grid of connections. It is going to allow us to fine-tune the behavior of communication in factories, in autonomous vehicles in many different areas. And then the introduction of distributed intelligence, which creates a whole new set of ethical as well as technical and business challenges. And the ethical components are becoming much more significant. It's been observed that if you had taken that 19th century factory, unplugged the steam engine, plugged in an electric motor, it would be cleaner, quieter, wouldn't really be safer. All those belts and pulleys would still be dangerous. But everything that was fundamentally wrong with that factory would still be wrong. Everyone would have to start and stop work at exactly the same time, work at exactly the same speed. There would still be very little ability to make products personalized or produce them in a more flexible way. And you would not get this. You can't go from the thing on the left to the thing on the right with incremental change. You can't move to autonomy, flexibility, any number, mobility. I looked for a drone instead of a thing on wheels because the flying maintenance robot is a thing. Couldn't find a good picture of one of those quite yet, but they're coming. And Tim Harford observed that the worker in the electrified factory, to take advantage of the greater flexibility, needed more training, needed better pay. You wound up with people who were able to create more value and therefore were worth more. And this is the question today. Are we helping people step up to the possibility of being more valuable and therefore being worth more to their companies? Eric Brynjolfsson and Lauren Hitt, who are at MIT and UPenn respectively, collaborated on some research on, is this true in the realm of IT as well as in the realm of factory production? And they found that over a large, rigorously evaluated sample of companies, there were those that had aspired to organizational change but been timid in their adoption of technology. There were those that had been vigorous and aggressive in their adoption of technology but slow to rework their manner of decision making and operations. And then there were the ones that had done both. And there was a beautiful 4-quadrant graph. The ones who did nothing did badly. The ones who did one or the other did and the ones who did both enjoyed substantially superior returns, because you had that great combination of a different way of working and behaving combined with technology to facilitate it. As I've mentioned, I don't like to walk into a room full of people who've been highly successful and tell them you're doing it wrong, because that is not obviously true and creates a certain, shall we say, antagonistic attitude. But I do occasionally share this quotation, often attributed to John Maynard Keynes: when the facts change, I change my mind. Now, I'm a little compulsive about sourcing quotations, so I went to the trouble of investigating this one. Apparently, Paul Samuelson made this up and attributed it to John Maynard Keynes, and it's been quoted as Keynes ever since. So maybe you can win a bar bet on this one as to whoever said it. But the important idea is this one: when the facts change, I change my mind. Are there facts I can share with our customers, with you today, that will alter the way you see stuff? Well, number one is this one: connectivity. When the first iPhone came along, all the bandwidth on the entire planet, all the networks, all the phone circuits, everything combined was about enough to give every person on the planet 3 ringtones a day. Not the phone conversations, just the 3 ringtones per day. By 2020, that number will have grown by well over a factor of 1,000. And that's, 5 versions of Beethoven's Ninth, along with extensive annotation and commentary, or it's the ability to measure what people are doing. Peter Sondergaard at Gartner said the old research is asking people, what do you want? Steve Jobs, of course, was famous for saying, there's no point in having focus groups. They won't know what they want until I show it to them. The notion instead, and this is back to Sondergaard, is that now we can measure what people seem to be trying to do and show them answers to questions that maybe they've taught themselves to stop asking. Because the well-balanced mind doesn't get up in the morning and get mad all over again at things that it should have learned to understand are like friction or rust or gravity. They're just unavoidable obstacles to getting stuff done. And so getting people to get mad all over again at things that they might have spent the last 20 years learning to tolerate is part of the process. Our own CEO has said when working, he did in fact specifically mention educators, he said working with the San Francisco schools, the phrase he found himself using most often was think bigger. Think bigger. Stop remembering, quote unquote, that you can't have that. Stop, having all those conversations where you've been told that costs too much, takes too many skills. We don't have the capital budget this year for that, maybe next year. Relearn all over again what you wish you had had, because today it might be something you can have literally for free, or in many cases for insignificant cost compared to what you've been used to expecting. You can see this in industries like watches. Smartwatches were who's going to need one of those things when they came along, and the unit sales are insane. And in fact, Apple is now a bigger watch producer than Switzerland. Just Apple, a product that did not exist until just a few years ago. And it now outsells what had been the virtual definition of that product, the heart of an industrial economy. It's been forced to remake itself as a luxury good, not as a superior timepiece. And the significant pivot is with the Series 4 Apple Watch, where now it's not just merely a fitness and communication device, but with the electrocardiogram capability, it's a wellness device. Because the fitness market is big, but the market of people who are someday going to be old enough that they want to keep track of their hearts, that's a market that's going to just be growing exponentially, and I'm using that word in a very technical way, for as far out as we can see. There's a second exponential. Any one thing, you can deal with it. It's when two things intersect, two or more things intersect, that things get exciting. And that's the degree to which compute power lets us find insight in data. If all we were doing is making better archival records of that which has already happened, there's power in that. But this is what's amazing. Now, if I plot this on a logarithmic scale, it's a straight line and it's easier to understand. This line, at least on a linear scale, it looks like we discovered computers in 2005. And this is not cumulative. This is annual additions to global business and consumer computing power. And that computation is not just calculation, it's analysis, it's prediction. It's doing a lot of things that we aspired to do literally 60, 64 years ago, and that now the power is there to do them at massive scale at reasonable cost. Because knowing stuff is one of the only durable competitive advantages. One of the books that I'll be sharing with you when I offer what I will be calling my summer reading list talks about this, that the mobility of capital, the mobility of talent, the mobility of intellectual property is huge. But simply knowing more about your customer is something that a new entrant to the marketplace cannot do overnight. And so the question of what do we know? Do we know what we know? Lou Platt at Hewlett-Packard famously said, imagine what Hewlett-Packard could accomplish if we knew what we know. That's something that most organizations don't do well. They're inherently siloed, inherently archival as opposed to forward-looking in the way they use data. And getting people out of that habit is a challenge. Merely having the data, as it turns out, is also not enough. This is an actual report that came out just quite recently, January of this year. They're keeping expensive airplanes in the air much longer now with predictive maintenance. But the Air Force actually had to go to Delta Airlines to get their insight into how to take piles and piles of data and make it usable for this kind of thing, to reverse engineer the data in ways that could be processed by machine learning algorithms. It turns out that the pile of data is not necessarily ready to feed to an AI. And this is a kind of data engineering that's relatively unfamiliar. And it's interesting to see this trade-off between the public and private sectors as they all face this similar challenge of discovering they've got tons and tons and tons of data, and getting the information out of it is something that takes skill. And the point I often make is that there's an old proverb that the best time to plant a tree for shade is 20 years ago. Well, at this point, I think we can say that if you think you're doing an AI initiative, the best time to start cleaning up your data was 3 years ago. But in either case, of course, the second best time is right now. This is another way of thinking about this. I don't know if you've ever swept a clean room, and by the time you've gotten to the corner, been kind of disgusted to find out how much dirt was spread all over that floor. There are a lot of things you can get away with doing with your data when you are working in separate siloed organizations at the speed of paper or email that become much more visible and difficult to handle when you bring it all together and try to feed it to an AI. So teaching people that AI is fun, data is not fun, but without the data, the AI is just a silly tech trick is an important message to get across. Among the challenges is that people talk about being data-driven and talk about being algorithmic, and it's really important to remember how much of your data arises from the behavior of human beings. There was an interesting exercise in this over the last few years. Some economies had their central banks going into the territory of negative interest rates to try to stimulate growth, to keep people from sitting on their money but go out and spend it. And when I described this to family members, I would get this kind of blank look saying, well, why would anyone pay their bank to hold their money when they could just put it in a shoebox? Well, in fact, in Germany, safe deposit box rentals went up. In Japan, sales of home safes went up. And when someone did this paper for the European central government on this notion of stimulative economic behavior, they threw in this one sentence: negative interest rate could trigger people to search for alternative ways to invest their money. And so a negative rate would be less stimulative than my analysis suggests. And I kind of think of this as a one sentence acknowledgement that maybe the entire paper was almost useless because it looked at algorithms and ignored the fact that they were about people, and people can do things that break the rules. The mouse can follow the maze, or the mouse can just jump over the wall of the maze and go find the cheese the easy way. This has been enshrined in the Harvard Law of Animal Behavior, that under carefully controlled conditions, the organism will behave as it damn well pleases. And we want to impute intelligence to these things the same way we want to see faces in clouds. This is what happens. If you show 30,000 pictures of cats to a neural net, it can get pretty good at saying, oh, I know what that is. That's a cat, the next time it sees a picture of a cat. Then someone asked the question, well, what if we run the algorithm backwards and ask it, well, what do you think a cat looks like? And have it generate its idea of a typical cat. As it turns out, many of the training images were pictures of cats with amusing comments above and below them. You're following what happened here. It did its best to simulate text-like squiggles above and below the face because in the mind, if I may use that term, of the neural net, those are part of the concept of cat. It has absolutely no real understanding of living creature. It doesn't know what fur is. It doesn't know what whiskers do. It doesn't know anything. And we impute intelligence to these things because we're used to that and we seek that, and we have to hit ourselves in the head at regular intervals to remind ourselves they don't actually understand a darn thing. They don't. And this is not, by the way, an isolated example. Another similar one was done with the word dumbbell, where a human hand and forearm were inseparable from the exercise weight as part of the machine's concept of what a dumbbell is, because the training set had not given it the tools to discriminate. So this is why Gartner is predicting that by next year, there will be a significant number of people whose job is to be essentially psychologists for the neural nets, to notice when they're starting to go off the rails and feed them carefully curated data to bring them back to work. If you know the Showtime cable show Billions, they basically have Wendy's job at the hedge fund of getting the traders back in the groove when they are starting to lose their thing. This is not the way we've thought about IT before. Someone said, the old model was computers are programmed, and the new model, computers are trained. And they need personal trainers as opposed to software maintainers. It's a different kind of skill, and it calls for a different kind of debugging, because debugging used to be a really mechanistic exercise, and now it's much more of a behavioral exercise. Here's another example of this, and those of you who were on the line before the call heard us talking about this. The degree to which now, instead of spending the first 20 years of your life becoming a PhD candidate, the next 10 years of your life becoming a member of the academy, finally knowing enough that you can propose an interesting hypothesis that's worth the cost and effort of going out to collect data to test it. That's how science used to be done. Now the data comes at you from every direction, and becoming a judiciously skeptical evaluator of that data is a much more important skill. These guys were written about in American Association for Advancement of Science journal, Science, recently. They have carved out a role for themselves, as they call themselves, as data thugs, and they evaluate their success by how many peer-reviewed papers they can get retracted, by pointing out that there are inescapable conclusions about their data just from reading their published results that strongly suggest that the papers are junk. For example, this one, a very simple example where a nutritional study of children could not fail to imply that at least one child ate 60 carrots in a single sitting. Well, that's maybe not entirely credible. And this question of what are your filter mechanisms? Are you essentially creating immune systems in your organization that look at data and don't assume that it was correctly collected and presented without bias, but are continually asking the question about, is there any way this could have been gotten or just fundamentally wrong? That's kind of important. And there's another example, which is not in this talk, but I'm going to share it with you very briefly, which is that in Japan, quite recently, they discovered that for about 10 years, they've been making a pretty basic mistake. At some point, a certain category of data that had been collected for every company in a certain space of the economy, they decided that it would be perfectly satisfactory to sample that data and only collect it from about a third of those companies. Well, the result of that is that when you add up all the numbers, you're no longer getting an estimate of the national total. You're getting roughly 1/3 of that number. Multiplication by 3 was not introduced into the process. The result that a huge category of public benefits and economic incentives was underpaid for years because a completely simple, dumb mistake like that was not calling attention to itself, and it altered behaviors in ways that really damaged a lot of people. And so this is a comment that was made by a guy named Daniel Dennett. He did a thought experiment in which, imagine a robot that's been told, go find your spare battery before you run out of power. It's in a closet, and you need to find it before the time bomb that's also in that closet goes off. And the robot finds the battery, wheels it out of the closet, and is blown up because, as it turns out, the bomb was on the same cart as the battery. So now you have to teach it, okay, now you have to look for related ideas. Now it goes into the closet, finds the battery, and apparently is doing nothing. And they go in and debug the thing and find out that it's been busily evaluating everything from the color of the paint on the walls to the shape of the doorknob and systematically saying, nope, that doesn't matter, that doesn't matter, that doesn't matter, that doesn't matter, and is completely overwhelmed by the task of figuring out what it can safely ignore. And when you think about it, this is the most remarkable thing, is that human beings, most of the time, are pretty good at ignoring what doesn't matter without having to think consciously about the fact that they're doing that. And yes, that far off whistling noise might possibly be a meteorite that's about to hit you and blow up the house. Most of the time you can get away without evaluating that possibility. We are not good yet at figuring out how we do this. And in programming that behavior is a challenge. So designing systems that know what to ignore is at this point a bigger research problem than designing systems that can reason well with what they've been told is actually important. Which brings us to the subject of people and how remarkable they are and how we need to amplify what people do well, as opposed to thinking that the job of technology is to replace them. Acceleration's a vector. I emphasize that because so often we talk about pace of change as if it were a scalar number. Oh, things are changing. Things are getting faster. Well, yes, they're getting faster, but they're also changing direction. And when you do your acceleration without changing direction, you may be doing the wrong thing better. In particular, we have spent the last 10 years participating in a global experiment called Let's Blow Up the World Financial System and Crash the Cost of Capital to Practically Zero. You can develop a lot of really bad habits in 10 years. You can develop a habit of thinking, well, innovation is about, are we adopting technology because we can finance it practically for free, borrow the money, put in, the robot. Booth School of Management at University of Chicago did an extraordinary exercise. They looked across many different industries, many different nationalities, and found that the labor fraction of value across the board, everywhere they looked, the labor fraction of value was going down. And here's what I was talking about earlier about kind of triangulation. People said for a long time that as we move toward more of a services economy, there's going to be less displacement of labor by technology because we don't have robots that can make beds in hotels. We don't have robots that make omelets yet, for example, very well. That the role of people was safe as we move to more of a services economy. But I don't know if you've stayed in a hotel recently and had them ask you to give them a heads up on what time you'll be checking in, what time you'll be checking out, maybe financial incentives for early checkout and so on. And when you think about the information that they're getting from you and the implications it has for their ability to schedule their cleaning crews more efficiently, it's my rough estimate that they can today maintain 5 rooms with a number of people that used to be able to maintain only 3, because they have better information about how to level the workload across that. And that's an example of how the technology is reducing the labor need, even though it's not directly substituting for the labor. And that these indirect effects, I think, are the things that catch people by surprise. And the talent pool of tomorrow looks different because of what I said before about George Friedman and demographic change. We had an age distribution of the population in 1990 that was pretty triangular. A lot of little kids and not very many people over the age of 70. Many people don't realize that when Social Security in the US was passed into law, only about 10% of the population lived to be 65 or older and collected. And now the typical member of the population may spend a quarter to a third of their life being older than that hard-coded number of 65. If that number had been based on a formula, based on demographic data, it would have gone up year after year without any politician having to get their fingerprints on that change. It would not be the untouchable third rail of American politics. But as it is, this is the challenge. We've got systems that are based on this triangular distribution of age, when in 2020, it's going to be starting to look a little bit more like that. And as soon as 2050, it's starting to get kind of rectangular out there. And you go a few more decades out, and you've got essentially identical numbers of people in each of the 5-year age bands. There is no playbook for this. There is no playbook for how to deal with healthcare when that much of your population is old, how to deal with transportation when that much of your population should not be driving cars anymore, maybe having difficulty with stairs and so on. There is no marketing experience in how to sell to the only thing we've ever seen in human history of an educated, affluent, experience-hungry, basically healthy population of people over 60. And in every major economy, that ratio of above to below is going to be mushrooming. In Japan, in Korea, it's already up there. In Central Europe, it's already up there. In the US, it would be up there if it weren't for immigration. And entire models of education, healthcare, employment, when you've got new hires now who are 40 or 50 years old because of people making career changes, HR departments, in many cases, I have managers tell me that their own HR department gets in the way of them hiring the kind of people they really want. They know how to hire the recent graduates with new skills. They don't know how to uncouple calendar age from life stage, which is a really important idea. Now, here's something else. This is from a study that was done a while ago at MIT and Wellesley, where people were asked, what did you learn in school? And they say, oh, I learned, scientific theory and knowledge of my subject matter, problem-solving skills, curiosity, critical thinking, yeah. Now, why is this list ordered this way? You'll notice that it's not ordered from top to bottom in terms of what they were best taught by their schools. It's not even alphabetical. It's ordered by this. The blue bars are, how important did this turn out to be when I got out into the workplace? And the ordering is more or less by how big was the gap. And you'll notice that they were well taught on scientific theory, maybe more than that turned out to be important, not at all prepared for clear communication, influence, cooperation, self-understanding, leadership. These were areas where school did not prepare them. My freshman picnic at MIT, Jerry Wiesner, who was President Kennedy's science advisor, was president of MIT at the time. I distinctly remember his remarks to the incoming freshmen, including a comment, as best I can recall his exact words, "We hope that you arrive here able to write and speak effectively about your work. We will not have time to teach that to you, but nothing will be more important to your success and your contributions." I remember looking around, I saw jaws dropping open. People with 800 math SATs and 500 verbals had just been told how screwed they were. Because back then the humanities requirement was something you went over to the humanities department to take your token class in writing 20 pages in a semester and checking a box. And the biggest difference between the MIT of now and then is the presence of so-called communication intensive classes in every major, where writing a paper or doing a presentation or some other aspect of communication is not treated as something that happens off in the humanities ghetto, but is a part of every major at the school. And any educational program that's not thinking about this is arguably doing a great job of imparting knowledge to people with a short half-life and not giving them the skills they need to be really successful. Because the degree to which the growing occupations are the ones that do require creativity, collaboration, systems thinking, adaptability, there are actually studies suggesting that people over 50 cope better with workplace technology today than people under 25, because people over 50 have been through more changes. They've worked with more generations of technology before they were any good, dealt with them when they were flaky and clumsy and hard to use, dealt with many cycles of change, and they've learned coping skills for imperfect and rapidly changing stuff that that younger people maybe not have not acquired quite yet. Another important insight is the degree to which keeping teams small and accountable to each other is key to success. Jeff Bezos at Amazon calls it the two pizza rule, that if the responsibility for an outcome is owned by a team too big to be fed by two large pizzas, then it's too many people to feel really accountable to each other. And so keeping pieces of project understandable at that kind of granular scale is really important to success. I've mentioned that we run a conference in San Francisco every year with about 170,000 attendees. And you might think, how do you do that? The answer is by breaking it down into a whole bunch of individual outcomes, each of which can be owned by a team of that size. And architecting organizations, architecting product improvement plans is key, so that you can have a single team say, nope, this thing's not ready. We're not going to ship it now. It'll be ready in 3 months. And we're going to say that with confidence and certainty, because we know that we architected this thing in such a way that we're not hurting any of the other teams by saying our piece isn't ready. So you have to be thinking about this, proactively. And research from military combat, professional sports, performing arts, any number of areas shows that this kind of architecture leads to amazing results. People don't do their best work out of fear or greed. They do it out of desire not to disappoint people whose opinion matters to them. Among the other challenges that we face is that of not knowing when we're biased, or worse, believing that because we've had our consciousness raised, that we have now confronted our unconscious biases, we've dealt with them. No, we really haven't. This is something I stole from someone at the CIA who said, it's like an optical illusion. I don't care how many times you've been told those lines are the same length and that they're perfectly aligned with each other. Your brain can't see that. Your brain is still telling you the wrong thing, even if another piece of your brain is saying, oh, don't believe that piece. Thinking that because your biases have been discussed, you don't have them anymore is a dangerous illusion. And what we have to do is build organizations where the tools are not merely available, but where using the tools becomes expected, where no one gets a free pass of being able to say, oh, I'm more experienced than you. I don't need to adopt that method because I've got judgment on that. Yeah, you probably do. And your judgment may be just as flawed as anyone else's, except that you're in an even worse situation because you believe you've overcome your biases. Building tools and cultures that deal with that is going to be a challenge. In fact, we need a new model in lots of ways. The half-life of our skills is short. The length of years that we need to be refreshing our skills is long. Employers say employees need continuous training, and employees say that among the reasons that they leave a company to go somewhere else is the sense that they're not having investments made in them, that they are concerned they'll be thrown away and or have their brains ground up and fed to the incoming crop of new graduates. And Paul Dougherty at Accenture put it in brutal terms. 50% of companies say their people aren't prepared to meet future skills needs, and only 3% of companies are actually increasing their own training investments. So I think anyone who is in the business of education in any way, from any aspect of that, should be getting in people's faces and saying, let's look at demographic certainty. You need to get more years of work out of people who understand your culture, understand your customer, understand your industry. You can't just bring in inexperienced new graduates and push out older and more expensive people, because you'll wind up with people who understand less about the things that are hard to learn and only have a transient advantage in skills that are quickly going to be overtaken by the next wave of new skills. I want to end with kind of a bigger picture about what are the facts that are changing right now. I've talked about connectivity. I've talked about computation. You probably expected to hear me talk about those things, but I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the big picture factual changes in the world that I think are going to drive massive change. Number one, well, I already talked about this one a little bit. Percentage of the population aged 60 years over by region. As you can see, globally, that so-called old age dependency ratio is going up. The regional variation is quite significant. In some parts of the world, it's going up somewhat. In other parts of the world, it's just skyrocketing. Connection. Let's talk about Africa for a minute. It's really easy to connect to the edge of Africa, and there are a lot of cables that connect to coastal cities. It's easy to get data in and out of, South Africa or Cairo. That's not, it's not terribly hard to do. The interior of Africa has really resisted development because it's just so darn difficult to communicate there. But as we move from cables to satellites, this is a chart that I picked up at the Pacific Telecommunication Forum this year. We're looking at the next generation satellite technology where there won't just be 4 satellite channels serving Africa. There'll be 4,000 narrowly targeted, high data rate channels available to serve an area where China's making massive investments in infrastructure for access to natural resources. The African economy is going to go through changes in the next 20 years that are probably greater than it's seen in the past 200 years. And this is not a daring prediction. This is a natural conclusion from energies that are already in play. The maps that we grew up seeing on the walls of our classrooms were really terrible. This is, of course, a Mercator projection, and some of you are probably conversant with the things that are wrong with it. Among them is, that by putting North and South America in the middle, they grossly understate the importance of Asia. They grossly exaggerate and distort areas and so on. I wonder if you know what the one thing that this projection is good for would be. If you draw a straight line on a Mercator map with a ruler and steer a constant course with a compass, that line will be your track. That's the one thing a Mercator map is good for, is steering a constant compass heading and getting a straight line on the map. So it's very good at navigating with old tools, but it does not take us to the places we want to be. Because if you flip the world upside down, which is kind of an arbitrary change, and maybe put the Pacific in the center, well, gee, things look a little bit different. I mean, all of a sudden, that region of Australia, China, India, and the east coast of Africa stops looking like something you can kind of ignore and becomes, oh my gosh, this is the treasure chest. This is where the raw materials are. This is where a huge fraction of the world's population lives inside that ellipse, an enormous fraction of the world's people are there. The minerals are there, the economic growth is there, and not having a strategy that is building your ability to work in those parts of the world, language skills, communication tools, familiarity with their laws and political institutions and customs, is going to be a problem. I've mentioned the serious area distortions of that Mercator map. It makes Greenland look about the size of Africa when in fact the actual ratio is more like what you're seeing down there. And in fact, to really understand how big Africa is, let me show you that the United States, China, India, Eastern Europe, most of Central Europe, and the UK all can be easily fit within its borders if you are not using a really messed up map like a Mercator. Not having an Africa strategy at this point is like not having a strategy for North America, China, and Europe in terms of the importance, because the middle class in that part of the world is growing rapidly and family size is going down and their education level is going up. And these are not daring predictions. This isn't futurism. This is just doing the math. Meanwhile, next door, of course, is Asia, where most of the next billion people to come into that middle class that I was talking about a while ago are there. That's interesting because most of them at this point do not have credit cards or checking accounts. They're going to leapfrog straight to digital wallets, which, for example, are already twice as heavily used in Mexico as they are in the United States. And while the United States economy and the Western Europe economy are running at the speed of paper checks and 3-day settlement times for securities transactions, these economies are going to jump straight to the next era of distributed ledgers that can settle a securities transaction in 30 seconds. I talked about forward-looking statements a while ago. Now I don't need to make a forward-looking statement. Salesforce just this week announced we will be offering a blockchain data model alternative because this is something that has the potential to make huge acceleration in the ability for multiple players to have a high level of trusted sharing of data. And that's a pretty important enabler for everything else I've been talking about today. When you look at questions of environmental sustainability, like moving to electric cars, it's kind of important to realize that building electric car batteries at massive scale requires right now access to certain materials, things like cobalt and lithium. Well, here's the problem. Most of those come from South Africa and South America and go to China. And China has largely locked up a tremendous amount of the current economic production volume of those things. So trying to grow your production of electric cars becomes a challenge. And unfortunately, it happens at the same time that rapid shrinkage of North Arctic sea ice is exposing whole new regions for extraction of, I'm sorry to say, more ice melting hydrocarbons, natural gas, and petroleum. These things are all happening, and they are intersecting, and they are compounding each other. And not looking at that big picture can result in you preparing very, very well for an incremental growth of what is and not preparing for dramatic change. This is an interesting list that was just put out recently by an organ of the U.S. federal government, the so-called National Critical Functions List. And when you think about it, it's an interesting guide to areas where you want to be really on top of where is technology changing, where are behaviors changing. For example, this list of connection capabilities, network services. I've talked about things like 5G and mobility. Asking yourself, are you ready for a massively intelligent global communication fabric and not just, phone calls? Are you able to deal with the revolutions in distribution? Or have you thought about the impact of autonomous trucks moving goods around? That's already a thing. That's already being tested in certain areas. Maybe even less transportation of stuff, more transportation of bits. The degree to which management of all of this is going to be changed. Are we creating law to handle things like cryptocurrency? Right now, cryptocurrency doesn't know what it is. Is it a currency that's handled by banks? Is it an asset that's handled by securities markets? Is it subject to banking rules? Is it subject to various other regulations? Whom can we ask? Who has the rules to control it? If I steal someone's password for a cryptocurrency account, have I committed forgery? Have I committed fraud? The laws don't even know how to talk about this stuff. And identity management is increasing challenge. The supply issues, access to raw materials, access to natural resources, critical area. So you put all these things together, you make this list and you say, am I building a curriculum that equips people to observe, evaluate, and react and proact in this world? There's a guy named John Boyd who teaches you fighter pilots how to not get shot down. And he uses the expression, the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. Traditionally, education's been very good at teaching people how to orient. It teaches them subject matter knowledge. Observation, well, you learned how to do that as a graduate student, maybe. Decision, oh, well, that's for the business schools. Action, I'm not sure who taught that. But getting everyone to have that kind of OODA mentality, because without any one of those four pieces, you do get shot down, is really the challenge that so many of us face. And so these four ideas of people, the connections among them, the resources that support the things they want to do, and the systems that manage the resources and the connections among all those people. That's kind of my new perspective that I want to share with you about where the facts are changing that we need to be building programs to prepare for. So I haven't talked much about AI. AI is a useful acronym, but I prefer to apply it to other things like analytic insight and augmented intelligence, making people better rather than replacing them, creating real meaningful innovation. AI was originally a computer science challenge. How do we write software that does what people do? It turns out we don't even understand what people do. People are terrible at explaining how they do the things that we say require intelligence to do. They're bad at explaining their problem-solving processes, bad at explaining their ways of coming up with insight. So trying to automate that ran into certain issues. There's a new paper that just came out in April that says we need to stop calling this artificial intelligence, which is the study of mechanisms, and call it machine behavior, because you study complicated things in their environment and not as separate ideas. And so this idea of studying AI not as a technology, but as a phenomenon of action taking place in an environment of social and legal and economic context is an interesting perspective, and it's gotten a lot of attention in just the 4 weeks that this paper's been out. This idea that we're studying machine behavior, not artificial intelligence, may be useful in pivoting the conversation in some good directions. I want to share with you one last observation. This is about combining what people do well, feel for a situation, intangibles, empathy with other people and what they're trying to get done, augmented with better tools, better connection, better measurement, better prediction, things that let us measure the length of those lines instead of relying on our eyes to tell us if they're the same length, for my earlier analogy. But this statement was made in 1962 by Douglas Engelbart, who also invented the first computer mouse. That's that object that he's holding there. We've wanted to do this for a long time. These are not novel goals, but the capability to do them is arriving, has arrived in many respects at an extraordinary pace that is still accelerating. And so getting on with this, I think, is really the exciting thing to do. Finally, I told Steve and Nicole and the rest of the team that I would share some of my books that have made me think in these peculiar ways. This is one that was originally published under the title of Systemantics, a pun on semantics and also on the phrase systems display antics, by an MD named John Gall. This is his rewrite of the book, which is more detailed. And it's funny, and it has cartoons, and it also has tremendous numbers of hard-hitting anecdotes about how easy it is for people not to see the systems in which they've become used to having to function. It's a tremendously valuable book. I probably think about it every day. Peter Drucker wrote this one in 1988, The New Realities. The amazing thing is that it doesn't read like a 31-year-old book. It still contains calls to action that I think most corporate managements would find challenging. And it's also extremely well written. Once you start reading Drucker, it's like potato chips. He got so many things so right. I've mentioned this one by implication, Tom Peters' book in 1987, Thriving on Chaos. He emphasizes that the title is not thriving in spite of chaos, but thriving in an environment of rapid chaotic change. And it's easily digested, it's very prescriptive, and has a lot of ideas that I think are very easy to share. I've talked about George Friedman's book, The Next 100 Years. Why am I putting this advertising book? Because it's called Ogilvy on Advertising, and yet it's largely about believing data, not being subject to bias and prejudice, building teams that can work effectively with changing reality. It says it's about advertising, but it's about so much more. And there's not a day that goes by when something in this book doesn't go through my mind. And then this is quite new. This book called Whiplash, co-authored by a guy who writes for Wired Magazine and the director of the MIT Media Lab. This is the most recent book on the list, and I'm still in the process of digesting it, but I recommend it. It's not terribly long. It's a good read, a lot of personal perspectives, and I think you might find it a very good piece of summer reading. So there's that quote that I mentioned earlier from Keynes, which he probably never actually said, "When the facts change, I change my mind." That famous quotation has a famous final sentence. What do you do? Because as we do our final one of these for your fiscal year, as Steve and Nicole were observing, as you think about what you come back in the fall ready to do, what are you going to do differently? I don't want merely to have entertained you. I want something to happen where you go look at some program you've been thinking about for years but thought was too difficult to do, or some method you've been thinking about introducing, or some partnership you've been thinking about exploring. And I want some actual change to have taken place, because then we will all have had a productive morning. Thank you for your time, Steve, Nicole. I appreciate the chance to have been with you all.
Wow, thank you, Peter. That's exceptional. The fire hose analogy still works. I was trying to ask myself, I think I saw Richard's question here too. So what do we need to teach and how? And it was kind of my same thought is, obviously what you shared is the larger global context of what we at a continuing education or career technical education level are trying to adjust to as we look at our curriculum, the shape of our curriculum, the various components to include in our curriculum, or how to take different pieces of different classes and put them into a program so that we're addressing these needs. It just opens up a huge box of learning. I think that's just an observation, not a question.
No, it's okay. In a way, what needs to be taught is scientific method. In so many subject areas, people think they, quote, are no good at science, or, quote, are no good at math, because education has become the transfer of subject matter knowledge from a book to a brain, instead of the creation of an attitude of inquiry, constructive skepticism, ability to be an informed evaluator of what's out there, instead of just having to accept what people tell you. And this is something that can begin at the elementary level and needs really to continue being stressed at the graduate level. Richard Feynman, the physicist, talked once about how he was meeting with graduate students of physics in Brazil. And he said, have you ever held up a piece of polarizing material and looked at the setting sun over the ocean? Notice that when you rotate it, you can cancel out the reflection. And they look at that, they say, oh, wow, that's really cool. And then in a later conversation, he asked them, do you know what Brewster's angle is? And it's the angle at which light reflected from a medium is polarized. And he established they were completely unable to connect everything that they had ever memorized about Brewster's angle from this physical phenomena that they were observing with their sunglasses looking at the setting sun. And that connection between the formality and the reality is really poorly addressed, especially as we focus in the elementary and middle school levels on the standardized testing approaches. The teaching to the test thing. There's so much danger of producing what seems to have been a measured success of subject matter understanding that's completely divorced from any ability to connect it to making change in the world. So
And,
anything you can do that makes it a lab type environment instead of a lecture type environment is a positive step.
and you said scientific method. I conjures up the hypothesis and the
Yes.
anti-hypothesis, and I'm
Yeah.
thinking that then maybe that is the method that we've always had to inspire critical thinking.
An old idea that is not any less valuable for being old. Yeah. It
Because I
is.
was really
It is under present in most classrooms where increasing class size, increasing challenges of diversity of language in the classroom, and all sorts of other factors have made it more and more difficult to make this part of early education. And if it's not part of early education, then it's even more difficult to establish that mindset later on. So anything that can be done to make that happen is productive, I think, in every area, not just in physical, not just in STEM.
well.
In every area.
I'm glad we've recorded this because I think some of us might want to watch it a couple of times because it's a huge amount of information.
I realize that the charts are data rich, and I'll make a PDF available that you can share as you wish, because I realize there's a lot of other content there that people might want to mull over.
Well, and I love the choice selection of books. I love it when you can go back 30 years and find something that's still relevant. And of course, Peter Drucker hits that is always good that way.
Absolutely.
I'm going to try to be fair to all of our attendees and to you, and go ahead and wrap this up without any further ado. And I see that some of the comments in the chat mostly supportive, and wow, isn't this something? And thank you, Peter, once again. And I'm not sure when you'll be presenting to groups at the community college system again, but we've got this on hold, and maybe we'll do a follow-up next year.
Well, if you do find that you want to do a quick compilation of unanswered questions and send it along, I will be happy to respond to it, and you can send it out to the group that was on the call today as a post reading. I would that would not be in a position. I realize I used every single minute of the time you gave me and more, and I would be perfectly happy to provide a follow-up of responses to questions that might have already come in, or maybe over the next hour or so. If you and Nicole want to collate those and send them along, I'll try to give you a timely response. I'm going on jury duty on Monday, so I might have some spare time.
Indeed you will. Those of you out there, if you have a particular question for Peter, please put it in the chat box, and we'll keep this line open for a while, and we'll capture those, and we'll send them on to Peter. Peter,
well, thank you for being generous at the time. It was great to be able to share with you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.